How 161 tons of gold made Venezuela a U.S. target. It's a paradox that just doesn't make sense. A nation sitting on top of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. A country that holds the biggest physical gold reserves in all of Latin America. Logic tells you this nation should be unimaginably wealthy, a true beacon of prosperity. But instead, it's a landscape of absolute crisis. Its economy has shrunk by a jaw-dropping 75% in under a decade. A humanitarian disaster has forced millions from their homes, and its society is gripped by poverty and chaos. This is the reality of Venezuela. How can a country so rich in resources end up so completely broken? It's a question that haunts economists and policymakers. The usual answers: mismanagement, corruption, socialism are all true, but they don't paint the full picture. They miss the most dangerous part of the equation. What if that enormous wealth, especially its glittering hoard of gold, wasn't a safety net? What if it was a bullseye? This isn't just another story about economic collapse. This is the story of 161 metric tons of solid gold, a national treasure that was supposed to be a lifeline. Instead, it became the country's greatest vulnerability. It's the story of how that gold turned Venezuela from a sovereign state into a primary target for American economic warfare, a pawn in a global resource game, and a tragic, real-world example of a terrifying phenomenon known as the resource curse. This is how 161 tons of gold, instead of saving a nation, helped seal its fate. Section 1. The Gilded Cage, a house built on oil. To understand why gold became so critical, you first have to get Venezuela's century-long addiction to another resource: oil. For most of the 20th century, Venezuela's story was the story of black gold after the massive La Rosa oil well blew out in 1922. The country was transformed overnight. Foreign companies rushed in, and by 1929, Venezuela was the world's second largest oil producer, right behind the United States. This flood of petrodollars built modern Venezuela. It paid for highways, hospitals, and a massive public sector. During the oil boom of the 1970s, kicked off by the OPEC embargo, Venezuela became the richest country per capita in Latin America. Workers earned the highest wages on the continent. In 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the industry, creating the state-owned giant, Petróleos de Venezuela, SA or PDVSA. For a while, it seemed the good times would never end. Venezuela was the poster child for a successful petrostate. But under the surface, a classic economic poison was spreading. It's a phenomenon called Dutch disease. The name comes from the Netherlands in the 1960s, after they discovered huge natural gas fields. The boom in gas exports made the Dutch currency so strong that it crippled every other export sector. Their success in one area made them uncompetitive in all the others. That's exactly what happened to Venezuela, but on a much bigger scale. For decades, the endless flow of oil money made it cheaper to import things than to make them at home. Why bother farming when you can buy food from abroad with oil dollars? Why build a factory when you could import goods for a fraction of the cost? Slowly but surely, the rest of the Venezuelan economy, agriculture, manufacturing, technology, withered away. The entire nation became dependent on a single source of income, one it didn't even control, dictated by the wild swings of the global oil market. This dependency also poisoned its politics. Governments, flush with oil cash, didn't need to rely on their citizens for taxes. This cut the fundamental link of accountability between a state and its people. Instead of building a diverse economy, oil money was used for populist social spending and, infamously, massive corruption. By some estimates, as much as $100 billion was embezzled between 1972 and 1997 alone. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he inherited this broken system and simply doubled down, riding a wave of anger against the old political class. He launched his Bolivarian revolution. He poured even more of PDVSA wealth into social programs called misiones, which did initially help reduce poverty. But he also began firing thousands of skilled engineers and managers from PDVSA. replacing them with political loyalists, and starting the slow decay of the company's expertise. For a time, as oil prices soared in the 2000s, the model seemed to work, but the underlying disease was getting worse. The House of Venezuela was built on a single pillar of oil, and that pillar was about to crumble. In 2014, the unthinkable happened. The global price of oil collapsed, crashing from over $100 a barrel to under $50. For Venezuela, this was a cataclysm. The government's budget, funded almost entirely by oil, evaporated overnight. The flood of petrodollars that propped up the entire society from food imports to social programs slowed to a trickle. Then it stopped. The implosion was immediate and brutal. The country spiraled into hyperinflation. Basic goods vanished from shelves. The GDP began a freefall that would ultimately shrink the economy by an almost unbelievable 75% between 2013 and 2021, with its main income source gone and its access to international credit cut off. The government of Chávez's successor, Nicolás Maduro, grew desperate. They needed hard currency, and they needed it fast. So, they turned to the only major liquid asset they had left, a treasure sitting in the vaults of the Central Bank of Venezuela and in banks around the world, their national gold reserves. The era of black gold was over. The tragic era of yellow gold was about to begin. Section 2. The dragons hoard the pivot to gold. As the oil economy fell apart, gold went from being a boring asset on a balance sheet to the government's most critical tool for survival. With oil revenue gone, the Maduro administration turned to its vaults. As of early 2026, those reserves stand at an estimated 161 metric tons. It's the largest stash in Latin America, worth tens of billions of dollars, depending on the day's market price. This hoard, however, used to be a lot bigger. In the early 2010s, Venezuela's reserves peaked at over 370 tons. But in a move just dripping with irony, then-President Hugo Chávez, spooked by the 2008 financial crisis, ordered the nation's gold brought back home from foreign banks. He staged a huge media event, with cameras rolling, as pallets of gold bars were unloaded in Caracas, calling it a declaration of economic sovereignty. He wanted the nation's wealth on home soil, safe from foreign interference. He never could have imagined that this very act would make the gold left abroad an even bigger target for the exact powers he mistrusted. For the Maduro government, the remaining 161 tons were a lifeline. The plan was simple: use the gold to do what oil couldn't. First, pay for desperately needed food and medicine to stop social unrest. Second, pay off billions in debt to allies like China and Russia, who had loaned the government money and now wanted it back. And third, most critically, pay the military and security forces to ensure they're loyal, the final arbiters of power in a nation on the edge. But this is where Venezuela learned the cruel lesson at the heart of the resource curse. This is the phenomenon where countries with incredible natural wealth often end up with less democracy, weaker economies, and worse development than countries with fewer resources. It's the paradox of plenty. The wealth fuels corruption, smothers other industries, and makes the nation a target. Venezuela was about to learn that having a treasure is one thing. Being able to actually use it is something else entirely. The government might have had the gold, but the world's financial powers were about to make sure they couldn't sell it. That 161-ton hoard wasn't a shield. It was a magnet. It drew the eye of the United States, which saw the gold not as a tool for humanitarian aid, but as the last fuel line keeping a hostile regime alive. The fight for Venezuela's survival was now a fight for its gold, and it was a fight Washington was determined to win. Section 3. The siege weaponizing the gold. As Venezuela's crisis got worse, the United States saw a strategic opening. Under both Obama and Trump, the policy was to pressure the Maduro regime into a democratic transition. But the tactics changed. What started as sanctions against a few individuals soon ramped up into a full-blown economic siege. And the main target of this new warfare was gold. The decisive blow landed on November 1, 2018. President Trump issued Executive Order 13,850. This order gave the U.S. Treasury the power to sanction anyone, anywhere who did business with Venezuela's gold sector. This wasn't a naval blockade. It was something far more subtle and, in many ways, far more devastating. A financial blockade. Here's how it works. By threatening to cut anyone who dealt with Venezuelan gold out of the U.S. financial system, the backbone of world trade, Washington effectively made Venezuela's gold toxic. No respectable international bank would finance a sale. No major refinery in Switzerland or London would dare touch the metal, fearing they'd be blacklisted. No legitimate trading house would risk its entire business for one deal with Caracas. The U.S. had weaponized the global financial system to cut Venezuela off from its own wealth. The ultimate proof of this new reality came not from Washington, but from London. Deep in the vaults of the Bank of England sat 31 metric tons of Venezuelan gold, worth over $1.9 billion. Since 2018, the Maduro government had been trying to get it back, arguing it was desperately needed for its pandemic response and to import food. The Bank of England refused. What followed was a years-long legal battle that shows exactly how a nation's sovereign assets can be turned into geopolitical hostages. The UK government, following Washington's lead, had formally recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. Guaido then appointed his own board for the Central Bank of Venezuela, which told the Bank of England not to give the gold to Maduro. The case went all the way to the UK's Supreme Court. In a series of rulings, British courts essentially confirmed that since the UK government recognized Guaido, it was his board, not Maduro's, that controlled the gold. It was an insane situation. Venezuela's sovereign property, stored in a foreign country for safekeeping, was now captive to the political decisions of another government. As one of Maduro's officials called it, it was an act of blatant piracy. The gold was physically in London, but geopolitically, it belonged to whoever the West decided it did. This financial siege didn't stop the gold from moving, though. It just pushed the trade into the shadows, turning a sovereign asset into a smuggled commodity. Blocked from legitimate markets, the Maduro government built a new, clandestine pipeline. Gold was flown out of Venezuela on obscure airlines, often with their transponders off, to the few places willing to ignore U.S. sanctions. The main hubs in this network were Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. The relationship with Turkey exploded after the 2018 sanctions. Trade between the two countries, once tiny, shot up to over $1 billion, almost all of it from Turkey importing an estimated $900 million of Venezuelan gold in that year alone. This gold would land in Turkey, be refined to hide its origin, and then be sold on other markets, with a huge cut of the profits lost along the way. Other, shadier routes popped up. Gold was smuggled across the border to Colombia and Brazil. It was flown to Africa, with Uganda becoming a surprising hub for laundering Venezuelan gold before it was re-exported to places like Dubai. These weren't clean, state-to-state sales. They were murky deals run through shell companies and corrupt officials, with every middleman skimming value off the top. This was the resource curse in its final, most vicious form. The very pressure designed to starve the regime had instead pushed it into the arms of criminal networks, forcing it to sell off its national heritage at a huge discount. The gold that was supposed to fund the state was now funding a sprawling black market, and the desperate scramble to get more of this gold would soon unleash a new hell inside Venezuela itself. Section 4. The internal war. The curse comes home. The international blockade forced the Maduro government to find more gold, and fast. With its official reserves trapped or dwindling, the regime turned its eyes inward, to the vast, untapped mineral wealth of its own Amazon basin. This decision would plunge a huge part of the country into lawless, violent chaos. In February 2016, Maduro signed a decree creating the Arco Minero del Orinoco, or the Orinoco Mining Arc. It designated a massive area of nearly 112,000 square kilometers, that's 12% of Venezuela's entire territory, an area bigger than Portugal, for mining development. On paper, it was a state-led plan to attract foreign investment and regulate the extraction of gold, coltan, and diamonds to save the economy. The reality was something else entirely. The mining arc became less of a state project and more of a legal veneer for plunder. It kicked off a violent, chaotic gold rush in one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth. Instead of orderly development, the state essentially handed over control to a toxic mix of players: Venezuelan criminal gangs, called sindicatos, Colombian guerrilla groups, and corrupt elements of the Venezuelan military itself. This created a lawless frontier. These armed groups now control the mines, enforcing their own brutal rule. They extort miners, control everything that moves in and out of the mining zones, and fight bloody turf wars over the best spots. For the tens of thousands of desperate Venezuelans who have fled to the region to survive, the conditions are hellish. They face forced labor, sexual exploitation, and unimaginable violence. Human rights groups have documented horrific abuses, including public executions and amputations for things like theft or not meeting quotas. The environmental destruction has been catastrophic. Illegal mining operations use tons of toxic mercury to separate the gold, which flows directly into the rivers. It poisons the water supply for hundreds of miles, contaminates the fish, and causes a severe health crisis for local population, especially indigenous communities who depend on the rivers for survival. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has warned of a crisis among the Yanomami people due to mercury poisoning. Satellite images show huge scars of dead rainforests, pockmarked with the craters of wildcat mines. This internal war is the final, tragic feedback loop of the resource curse. The external pressure from U.S. sanctions, meant to cripple the regime, created an insatiable demand for illicit gold. This demand drove the government to authorize the plundering of its own territory. That plunder, in turn, empowered violent gangs and corrupt officials, who now run their own fiefdoms financed by blood gold. It's estimated that a staggering 86% of the gold now produced in Venezuela is illegal, with most of it smuggled out of the country. The gold was no longer just a target for the United States. It had become the fuel for an internal war that is tearing the social and environmental fabric of southern Venezuela to pieces. The wealth under the soil, once a promise of a bright future, had risen to the surface as a torrent of violence, disease, and destruction. The curse was now complete, consuming the nation from the outside in and the inside out. The story of Venezuela's 161 tons of gold is a tragedy in multiple acts. It begins with a nation built on the shaky foundation of oil, a petrostate that fell victim to the predictable poison of Dutch disease, hollowing out its own economy until only a single pillar was left standing. When that pillar of oil collapsed in 2014, the nation turned to its last great treasure, its gold. But that treasure wasn't a shield. It was a bullseye. The gold became a key target in a campaign of maximum economic pressure from the United States. Through sophisticated financial sanctions, Washington made Venezuela's sovereign wealth radioactive, cutting it off from the world. This act of economic warfare led to the unprecedented capture of 31 tons of gold in the Bank of England, a nation's assets held hostage by the political whims of foreign powers. But that wasn't the end. The pressure didn't stop the gold from flowing. It just rerouted it into the shadows. Forced into black markets, Venezuela had to sell its national heritage at a discount through clandestine networks in Turkey, the UAE, and beyond, turning a state asset into a smuggled commodity. This desperation for untraceable gold then fueled the final, devastating chapter, an internal war. The creation of the Orinoco mining arc unleashed a plague of illegal mining, run by criminal gangs and corrupt officials, that now poisons the nation's rivers, destroys its forests, and brutalizes its own people. The 161 tons of gold, instead of a national savior, became a catalyst for corruption, a magnet for international pressure, and a symbol of Venezuela's catastrophic loss of sovereignty. It perfectly illustrates the core idea of the resource curse, that immense natural wealth, without strong, transparent, and diverse institutions, can become the very tool of a nation's destruction. Today, the political stalemate continues. The sanctions largely remain. The gold keeps being sold off, piece by piece, and the battle over Venezuela's vast resources, its oil, its minerals, its future is far from over. It serves as a grim and powerful reminder for the 21st century. A nation's true wealth isn't what it owns, but what it can control. For Venezuela, its golden treasure proved to be a weight it couldn't carry, a prize it couldn't defend, and ultimately, a curse it could not escape. If this story revealed the hidden mechanics of global power, subscribe for more deep dives that explain the world, not just report on it. And click here to watch our next video on how another resource-rich country fell into a similar trap.